They called Etta Vance crazy the day she started building a winter house out of broken whiskey vats. By January, the only candle in Bitter Creek that did not flicker during a whiteout would be burning inside her walls. At the time, nobody believed that. By noon, 3 ranch hands had stopped their horses just to stare. By sundown, the owner of the biggest lumber yard in Bitter Creek had come up the rise to tell her she was about to kill her own children. What stood on her claim did not look like a proper cabin. It looked like the ribs of some giant barrel, cut apart and raised into the wind. The curved white oak staves still smelled faintly of bourbon and smoke. Their iron hoops lay in the dirt beside her boots. And Etta, sleeves rolled, hair pinned back with a carpenter's nail, was fitting those bowed pieces into 2 long walls no frontier man in Wyoming territory had ever seen before. Harlan Creed spat into the dust and laughed. "A wall's meant to be straight," he said. "Straight, tight, and solid, not bent like salvage." 2 other men nodded with the easy confidence of people certain the world had already taught them everything worth knowing. But Etta did not stop working. She drove a wooden mallet against an iron drift, tightened one of the old hoops around a row of staves, and looked up only once. "A barrel's meant to hold pressure," she said, "and winter is pressure." That answer followed the men all the way back into town. Before dark, Bitter Creek had settled on its opinion. The widow from Louisville, the cooper's daughter who had come west after her husband died on a freight run, had finally lost what sense grief had left her. She had survived 1 bad winter in a plank shack, and come away believing she could outsmart the wind with junk. What none of them understood was that Etta was not trying to build a thicker wall. She was trying to break the path the cold used to travel. And when the first killing whiteout rolled down from the north 6 weeks later, the warmest room in Bitter Creek would not belong to the man with the biggest woodpile. It would belong to the woman who built with curved oak, tarred hemp, and a strip of trapped air no one else thought was worth anything. Etta Vance was not a carpenter in the way Wyoming respected carpenters. She had not grown up framing barns or squaring timbers. She had grown up in a cooperage on the Kentucky River, where her father made casks for whiskey houses and pork packers. By 12, she knew how to read grain in white oak. By 14, she could heat and bend staves without splitting them. By 16, she understood something most men around Bitter Creek did not. Wood failed where force gathered badly, and survived where force was guided somewhere else. A good cask was not just wood. It was geometry. Curved staves pushing against one another. Iron hoops turning weakness into tension. Seams packed so tight that liquid could not wander through them. Pressure distributed. Nothing wasted. When she married Tom Vance and came west, she brought that trade in her hands. But Bitter Creek had no use for whiskey casks. It needed sheds, bunkhouses, corrals, and freight shanties. So Tom hauled goods, and Etta did what frontier wives always did. She made do. The first winter after they arrived nearly killed her son. Their house had been a cheap rectangle of green pine boards bought on credit from Harlan Creed's yard. In October, it looked respectable. By December, it had become a lesson in failure. As the boards dried, they shrank. Hairline cracks opened everywhere. The wind found each one. At night, Etta would hold a lamp near the wall and watch the flame tremble. Not because a door was open, because the whole house leaked. She stuffed seams with rags. She hung quilts over the north wall. She fed the stove until the iron glowed red. Still the heat went missing. Still the floor stayed mean with cold. Still little Ben woke up one morning with blue lips and a cough that sat in his chest for weeks. Tom died the following spring, when a freight wagon overturned on black ice in the canyon east of town. After that, every choice Etta made had the hard clarity of survival. She was 29, in debt, alone with 2 children. And winter did not care about sympathy. That was when she stopped thinking like the town. The men around her kept talking about heavier walls, more lumber, bigger fires, more chopping, more feeding, more fighting. Etta kept thinking about the space inside a cask wall. Not the wood, the stillness between surfaces. The fact that a sealed layer of quiet could do what another inch of oak never would. Solid wood carries heat. Give one side fire and the other side winter, and the energy walks straight through the grain. That was the mistake in every Bitter Creek shack. People thought mass meant protection, but the walls were really bridges. Etta wanted a break in the bridge. In late summer, a freight derailment west of the rail spur left 4 giant bourbon vats shattered in a supply yard. Most people saw ruined timber. Etta saw curved staves, seasoned oak, iron hoops, and a second chance. She bought the wreckage cheap. Then she built the strangest house in the territory. First she laid a low stone foundation above the mud line. Then she set an outer wall of long bowed staves, banded and pegged into a timber frame. 9 inches inside it, she built a second wall that followed the same curve. Not touching, never touching. Between them, she left a narrow cavity running the full length of the house. That gap was the heart of everything. If air moved inside it, the design would fail. Warmth from the inner wall would rise, cool against the outer wall, sink, and carry the heat away in a silent loop. So Etta did what Coopers had always done when something had to stay put. She packed every seam with tarred hemp. She sealed the edges with hot pitch. She turned the cavity into a dead, quiet layer. She was not building with air. She was building with air that could not move. Even the shape of the house offended people. Frontier homes in Bitter Creek were all corners and flat faces. They took the full punch of the wind. Pressure built on the outside boards and forced cold through every weakness. Etta's walls were gently bowed. Not round like a barrel, not flat like a box. Just enough curve to make the gusts slide. The same logic that kept a cask from bursting and a river skiff from taking a wave broadside could keep a winter wall from being bullied by the plains. Molly Finch from the next claim asked Etta, half worried and half embarrassed for her, what she was supposed to tell people in town. "Tell them I'm tired of heating the outdoors," Etta said. The roof went on in November. Simple rafters, shingled tight. Nothing fancy above. All the intelligence was hidden in the walls. By the time the first hard frost silvered the sage, the Vances had moved in. Outside, the house looked odd enough to keep every joke alive. Inside, it felt different before the stove was even lit. The room held itself. The air did not wander. Silence sat in the corners. Bitter Creek took that as one more sign of madness. It would need colder proof. The proof arrived in January with a sky the color of gunmetal. Old men in Bitter Creek had a way of reading weather by the feel of it in their teeth. That morning, every one of them said the same thing. North wind. Bad one. By noon, the light went flat. By 3, the first snow was no longer falling. It was traveling sideways. Then the real blow came. A whiteout hit the basin so fast that horses in the open turned their backs to it and stood like statues. The temperature dropped below 0 before sundown. Wind came screaming over the flats in long, punishing blasts that lifted old snow and fresh snow together until the whole world became one moving wall. Inside the town's straight-board houses, the siege began. At the Finch place, frost crawled along the inside window frame before supper. At the telegraph shack, a draft under the sill kept the operator in gloves while he worked the key. At Harlan Creed's 2-story house, built from his best milled pine, the north bedroom had to be abandoned by dark. The walls were tight by local standards, but they were still single skin. They radiated cold like wet stone. His wife pulled the children's mattresses into the middle room and kept coffee near the stove all night because no cup stayed warm for long. In Etta's house, the lamp flame stood almost still. That frightened her more than she admitted, because now the gamble was no longer theoretical. If she had misjudged anything, it would not just be embarrassment. It would be Ben and Clara sleeping inside an experiment the town had begged her not to try. So she watched everything. She watched the seams. She listened at the walls. She laid her palm against the inner staves and waited for the bite of outside cold to creep through. It never came. The stove burned low and steady. The warmth rose, touched the curved ceiling, and settled gently back into the room. No whistle in the cracks. No knives of air at ankle height. No frantic feeding of fuel every 20 minutes. For the first time since coming west, her children slept without hats on. Outside, Bitter Creek was at war with the same storm. Near midnight, the gale tore the canvas loose from the top of Harlan Creed's lumber stacks. The heavy sheets snapped like rifle fire in the dark. Harlan and his eldest clerk went out with ropes and lanterns, because a winter's inventory was one bad gust away from ruin. They fought the storm half blind. Snow struck so hard it felt thrown. The yard vanished in white. As they dragged for the loose edge of the canvas, one bundled stack of plain boards shifted, slid, and spilled down the slope behind the yard. Harlan lunged after it, cursing, and lost both footing and sense of direction. He found himself not in his own yard, but at the lee side of Etta Vance's ridiculous house. He hit the outer wall shoulder first and stopped. Then he noticed something impossible. The wind was raging hard enough to make fence posts hum. Yet the wall under his glove did not shiver. It did not radiate that deep winter ache he knew from every plank building on the plains. It felt strangely neutral. Not warm, not frozen, just absent of the cold that should have been there. Harlan pressed himself harder against it and stood in the dark, confused. He should have been feeling a wall under attack. Instead, he felt a surface the storm had somehow failed to reach. He shuffled toward the window, shielding his lantern. Inside, in the yellow light, Etta's children were asleep. A kettle sat near the stove, and on the table closest to the glass, a tallow candle burned with a flame so steady it looked painted there. Outside, the blizzard was trying to sand the whole settlement off the map. Inside that strange boathouse, the flame barely moved. That was the moment Harlan Creed stopped laughing. He hammered on the door with a midden stiff with ice. When Etta opened it, the wind rushed in around him, making the candle flutter for the first time all night. Then the door shut, and the stillness returned. Harlan stood in her entry with snow frozen in his beard, and the look of a man who had just felt the floor give way under something he believed too completely. He looked at the stove. Small, no hotter than his own. He looked at the walls. Curved, quiet, dull with lamplight. Then he asked the only question left to him. How? Etta did not answer right away. She handed him a blanket for his shoulders, then crouched beside the wall and tapped the inner staves with her knuckles. 2 skins, she said, not one. He frowned. She fetched a stub of carpenter's chalk and drew on the back of a flower board. An outer curve. An inner curve. A narrow space between them. You sell wood like it's the wall, she said. It isn't, by itself. She drew a line through one thick board. Heat walks through solid things. Give it one road, it takes it. Then she tapped the gap she had drawn. But make it cross still air, and the road breaks. Harlan said nothing. She kept going, because now that he had felt it, he could finally hear the explanation. Not open air. Still air. If that pocket breathes, you lose. Warm side rises, cool side falls, and the whole wall starts carrying your heat away. That's why I packed every seam. That's why I pitched the edges. I didn't need a bigger wall. I needed a quiet one. Harlan looked back at the candle. And the curve? He asked. The curve takes the shove out of the wind, Etta said. A flat wall argues with a gale. A bowed wall lets part of it slide. He put his hand on the inner staves then, more gently than before, as if he were touching not a wall, but an idea that had already embarrassed him. By dawn, the storm had begun to ease. By afternoon, the story had started moving through Bitter Creek faster than the drifts could be cleared. Harlan Creed, loudest critic in town, had spent the worst stretch of the Whiteout in Etta Vance's cask house, asking questions like an apprentice. Men came first, out of disbelief, then out of self-interest. They stood inside the bowed room and looked foolish in their heavy coats. They pressed palms to the wall. They stared at the seams. They crouched beside the stove, trying to understand how such a small fire could do so much less work. Etta showed them without vanity. The dead air chamber, the tarred hemp, the rule that the two walls could never bridge each other in too many places, or the cold would find a path through the fasteners. The reason the curve mattered. The reason silence mattered more. When Molly Finch came through, she did not touch the walls first. She touched Etta's children's blankets. Dry, warm. No frost stitched across the top edge. That detail reached the women before any explanation about heat ever did. And that was the new tension for Bitter Creek. Not whether Etta had been right. That was settled. The tension now was whether pride would let the rest of them change. Pride held for about 3 weeks. Then woodpiles started shrinking. Then another hard freeze came through. Then Harlan Creed did something no one expected. He changed his stock. By spring, the biggest cellar in his yard was no longer the thickest board he could mill. It was a kit of matched inner and outer planking, spacer blocks used sparingly, rolls of tarred fiber, and a handbill explaining how to keep an air cavity sealed and still. He could not supply giant whiskey-vats to every homesteader on the prairie, but he could sell them the principle Etta had proved. People started calling it the Vance Wall. The first copies were ugly. Most first copies are. Some men made the curve too shallow. Some bridged the cavity with too many braces and complained the wall felt colder. Air gap vented and learned the expensive difference between trapped air and moving air. Etta corrected them when they asked, and when they did not ask, Winter corrected them for her. Within 2 years, freight offices, line shacks, and 3 ranch houses along the Bitter Creek Basin had adopted some version of her method. The best builders kept the wall double, the cavity sealed, and the windward face gently bowed. They used less fuel. Their children coughed less. Their blankets stayed dry. Harlan never became a humble man. Men like him rarely do. But he became an honest witness. Whenever newcomers laughed at the Vance place, he took them there himself. He would set a hand on the wall and say, "Feel it," then argue. Etta never patented anything, never wrote a paper, never called herself an inventor. She said she was only a cooper's daughter who got tired of watching heat leave through bad walls. But what she had done was bigger than thrift. She had taken knowledge from one world and carried it into another. She had understood that the frontier's real enemy was not simply cold. It was wasted effort, wood chopped badly, heat spent foolishly, houses built to look right instead of work right. Everyone in Bitter Creek had been trying to beat winter with more material and more force. Etta beat it by interrupting a path no one else could see. That is why her story lasted. Long after the original cask house had weathered silver and the iron hoops had gone red with rust, people still pointed to it when the north wind came hard over the flats. They pointed to the bowed walls and the narrow, hidden quiet inside them. And they told their children that warmth is not always a matter of having more. Sometimes it is a matter of giving the cold nowhere to go. And that was the lesson Etta Vance left on the Wyoming frontier. The strangest structure in the valley became the soundest one, because she understood that survival does not always belong to the strongest wall. Sometimes it belongs to the smartest gap.